Right, let's make a start. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you all had a lovely Easter. Welcome back to the CNI. I'm excited to hear about this project because I know Sam is in the process of writing this up, but I remember a few years ago that I was one of the participants, so I have a unique. I still have long-term memory of those stimuli, so I'm excited to hear what he's got to say. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you all for coming along to hear the talk. Yeah, as Chris mentioned, this is a project that we're currently writing up now for publication, so I'd be very keen to hear any feedback or thoughts that you will have. This project did run quite a long time ago now at CISC, so it's good to finally be giving a good update on this project at the CNI. Okay, so to begin and introduce, let's see. I have been seriously considering joining this this troop of chimpanzees. Seriously. And if I was to do this, hypothetically, it would be very important for me to figure out where in the social hierarchy I would fit into. Because social hierarchies are very important to chimps, and my place in that would determine my overall health, fitness, and well-being as part of this troop. And so on one occasion, I may observe that the chimp circled in red asserts its dominance and is more dominant than the chimp circled in purple. And separately, on a completely different occasion, let's say a completely different day, I may learn that I am not as dominant, I'm less dominant than the chimp circled in purple. Now, with those two pieces of information, I should be able to infer that I will also be less dominant than the chimp highlighted in red. And it would be needless for me to try and explore that dominance relationship. I already have enough knowledge to infer that relationship. And needlessly exploring that would only lead to bad things for me. So, kind of doing these transitive inferences, inferring a property like dominance across a social hierarchy is a really core skill for many species, including humans. It helps us guide, learn structured representations of our environment and our social hierarchies. And this learning of these schemas like dominance and these hierarchical structures is something that we were really interested in exploring in this study. So that's what I'll be talking about today. So the question is, how do mammals in general and humans in particular learn learn to do these memory generalizations, where they generalize the experiences across a set of different memories together into to generate new knowledge? Well, there are two broad models or mechanisms that allow you to do this that are talked about in the literature. The first set of models I will refer to as encoding-based models of memory generalization. They're also sometimes referred to as structural models of memory generalization. And you also separately have retrieval-based models. These are very broad classes that I'm talking about here, and I've just shown us two examples of each underneath the titles here. So let's start with retrieval-based models. It's somewhat easy to illustrate. And the idea here is that you emphasize the separation between memories to begin with. So let's say the memory representation AB is my observation that the chimp circled in red was more dominant than the chimp circled in purple. Okay, so that's a memory that I've encoded as a unique experience. And separately to that, I've learned in a separate memory, a separate event, episodic memory, if you like, that chimp B is more dominant than myself. That might be BC. And so if I have a memory network structured in this way, where I've got separate memory representations for each of these pieces of information, I can do some special kind of recurrent processing to kind of piece the information together and on the fly infer that I must be less dominant than the red chimp. And the idea here is that you have separate memories that kind of at the point of inference, you do some hard work, some difficult work, which involves retrieving multiple memories in a sequence in order to construct a hierarchy and make a transitive inference like that. That's a retrieval-based model or a retrieval-based mechanism. And remerge by Dash Kumarin is a very good example of that. There's lots of good evidence for it in the literature as well. Encoding-based models of memory generalizations are quite different in that they don't emphasize this pattern separation, this separation between memories. Instead, they propose that from the beginning, you start to form a structural overview of the hierarchy from first principles. So the idea is that you're learning a kind of a schema or a chain in the case of a hierarchy, where one individual is at the top of the hierarchy and one individual is at the bottom, and then there's people or there's chimps in between, if you like. So the idea is that you directly learn the hierarchy per se as its own memory or as its own representation. And that's kind of illustrated here with this blue grid. You can think of this is a two-dimensional grid, but it would work for one-dimensional hierarchies or any kind of things, memories that you would want to generalize. From first principles, there's the difficulty. The difficulty here is that you have to learn that hierarchy to begin with. But once you've done that, once you put in that hard work to kind of learn and infer the hierarchy, when it comes to making the inference, well, it's just as simple as retrieving that memory that you've formed. So it kind of the hard work here happens at different times. In encoding-based models, structural models of memory generalizations, you do the hard work to begin with. You learn this hierarchy as it is, and then you just retrieve. It's as simple as just retrieving that hierarchy when you make an inference. In retrieval-based models, you don't do any of that ahead of time. You do the inference on the fly by kind of piecing things together in a piecewise manner. Okay, so just to say, there is good evidence for each of these two classes of models. We know that these do happen somewhat together in the human brain and in animals. There's good evidence that non-humans, I should say, non-humans do both, if you like. So the question is, under what conditions does an animal or an agent use a retrieval-based model of generalization versus an encoding-based model of generalization? And that's really what we were looking at in this study. Okay, so I had the idea, and I can expand on a little bit where this idea came from. I had the idea that it could be that how you encounter the information that this hierarchy is based on is important for whether you learn an encoding-based structural model for generalization, or you do these generalizations via a retrieval-based mechanism. Specifically, I thought, well, if you kind of encounter the information that the hierarchy is based on in a structured, ordered way, that's very conducive to learning the hierarchy. If you learn in a structured way that chimp A is more dominant than chimp B, and chimp B is more dominant than chimp C, and so on and so forth, that kind of order of encoding is very amenable to layering memories on top of each other, if you like, and it's very conducive to learning a hierarchy from the outset. In contrast, if you encounter different pieces of information in a random order, you kind of experience floods in with like in a completely unstructured way. It may be very, very, especially if you're dealing with a very high, a very complicated hierarchy or a structure in more than one dimension, in two-dimensional structure, it might be very, very difficult to kind of piece together a hierarchy from the outset. And so you might have to emphasize pattern separation between these memories. You might have to say, put each memory into its own discrete box, and then when it comes to doing an inference, kind of integrate them together on the fly. So that was the thought of the idea. How you learn the information might influence how you generalize. A lot of the encoding-based models of generalization, they're based on movement through physical space. So the idea is that as you move through a physical space, you're kind of learning a structured representation of that environment. And I think we can't overlook that when you explore a new house, if you've moved into a house for the first recently, or you're exploring a new environment for the first time, you encounter that in a very progressive and structured way, and that might be central to why you can form a structured representation. You don't teleport from one corner of the room to another corner of the room. You encounter it in a very structured, ordered way. So this is really what we were exploring here. I call this progressive versus interleaved learning. And there'll be more, this will hopefully become more obvious as I talk through what we did in the study. Another hypothesis that we were looking at in this experiment was the role of a period of memory consolidation. So there is separately, some people have suggested, some researchers have suggested that encoding versus retrieval-based generalization mechanisms are employed at different phases of learning. So if you've not learnt a set of associations or discriminations very, very well, then when it comes to generalizing them, you use a retrieval-based mechanism. But if you've learnt them very, very well indeed, then you've probably also learned a structured representation in kind of like a structured encoding-based you'll use an encoding-based mechanism for generalization. So we thought, well, maybe memory consolidation, a period of offline consolidation during sleep or something like that, would allow you to kind of piece separate memories together and form a generalized a representation of the whole hierarchy, if you like. So that was another thing that we're testing. Does a period of offline consolidation allow you to extract generalized representations of a hierarchy or whatever it is? Okay, so what did we do for this? Well, outside of the scanner on 2 separate days, we placed participants into this virtual reality environment, this virtual environment. On each trial, they were presented with 2 buildings side by side. And the only thing that differed between these 2 buildings were the wall textures that were rendered onto the outside of each building. So one building, there were many, many different wall textures, but they were always different. So you could always discriminate them. And the idea was that one of these buildings contained a pile of virtual gold, like some reinforcement, and participants had to use trial and error learning to kind of figure out which wall textures were associated with reward. And it wasn't as simple as one wall texture always led to a reward. It depended on what the other wall texture was. So I'll refer to these wall textures by letters. So let's say this wall texture with the pale tiles is wall texture A. And this wall texture with the kind of gray blocks is wall texture B. You would have to learn that wall texture A contains the reward, it contains the virtual reinforcement, whereas B does not. And in a separate trial, you would learn that wall texture B contained reward over a different wall texture C, and you learned 6 pairs in total. So A is better than B is better than C, and so on and so forth, all the way down this linear hierarchy here. And you learn those in separate trials, I should say, on one particular day. On the next day, participant came in. They didn't do any kind of inference before at that point or during training at all. They just came in the next day and they did a very similar sort of task, exactly the same, except they encountered completely different wall textures that they hadn't seen before. And unbeknownst to them, unless they figured it out, they formed the same hierarchy, or they implied the same hierarchy. So they learned A better than B better than C, and so on and so forth. So they learned these outside the scanner on 2 separate occasions. And after the second day of training, when they learned the second chain, they went inside the scanner and they recalled all the directly trained associations, or discriminations, which are I've highlighted here in red, and 6 inferred discriminations. So the inferred discriminations are B greater than D, C greater than E, and so on. And they have different distances as well. You can think of B greater than D as a distance of 1 or 2, because you're jumping over 2 stimuli. B versus E is a distance of 3, so on. And between participants, so we had just to reiterate, we had these two chains trained on each day. So the chain that they learned on day one was a remote condition where they had a period of sleep and rest before they went into the scanner and did the inference. And the discriminations that they learned on the day of scanning were recently formed memories because they had only just learned them before the scanning procedure. And then that was within participants, that manipulation of recent versus remote. Between participants, we either presented the discriminations in a progressive manner where participants were shown A versus B first, and then they moved on to B versus C, and so on and so forth. And kind of as the trials continued, they were gradually exposed to this hierarchy along a linear path, or they just learned them in an entirely random order. So this is the interleaved training condition. And just as a reminder, our hypotheses were that these two conditions would lead to different mechanisms for memory generalization, or for the inference, the ways of doing the inference. Okay, so just to show that's not a completely crazy idea, one thing that we did was to train a very simple neural network to do this task. And we trained it on the premise or the trained associations alone. So we showed it A versus B, B versus C, and so on and so forth down the hierarchy in either a progressive or an interleaved training order. So we trained this neural network either by presenting the trials in progressive or interleaved order. And we found that while the performance on the directly learned discriminations was comparable irrespective of interleaved or progressive training, actually the training order really does have an effect on inferences. So these are exactly the same inferences that I was talking about before, B versus D and B versus E, and so on and so forth, with different distances. Really, it does seem that when you train progressively, you, even with this very, very simple neural network, you kind of guide the model to learn representations that make it amenable, make it capable, more capable than not of doing these inferred discriminations. It has an effect even in this simple network. It's not as simple as that, I wouldn't say, because there were some models that learned via the interleaved method that performed very, very well. In fact, they performed much better than any of the progressively trained models. So it kind of reduced the progressive training reduced the variance in performance, and it pushed it up on average, but it reduced the variance. And actually, it might be that interleaved training makes you, it might still allow you to encounter these really good solutions. Anyway, that's just by the by. This was really just a proof of concept to show that these kind of different training mechanisms can have fundamental differences in what's learned in even very simple neural networks. So we're not completely crazy thinking that this is actually going to work in humans. So what happened in humans? Well, here I'm presenting the performance by condition for all of the directly trained associations, so the discriminations, so A versus B, B versus D, and so on. And across conditions, there were no differences, basically, which is what we wanted to see. We wanted to see that people were very good at the task inside the scanner. I should say this is all inside the scanner from now on. I'm not talking about the training periods at all. Inside the scanner, people did really well. They learned basically to seal. They had learned to sealing. They did really well at the directly trained associations, regardless of experimental condition. There were we used Bayesian stuff to tests to show that there was no differences between any of these conditions. But their performance on the inferred discriminations was very dependent on the experimental condition. Most strongly, it was dependent on the progressive versus interleaved distinction, this training method factor. We didn't see much of an effect of recent versus remote. I will bring up where we did find differences, but I'm not convinced that really recent versus a period of overnight consolidation has much effect, especially at least in this context. So I'm not going to make any big claims about overnight consolidation during the rest of this talk, but I will mention it a couple of points. But the thing to note here is that progressive learners, progressive learners massively outperformed interleaved learners on the inferred discriminations, and they actually performed better on the inferred discriminations than they did on the direct discriminations, there's a very good reason for that I will explain later. But whereas the interleaved learners, they were above chance statistically, but not much. These are confidence intervals. These are 95% confidence intervals I'm showing here. Okay, reaction times told a very similar story. Reaction times to inferred discriminations were much lower in the progressive learners than they were in the interleaved learners, showing that they had an easier time doing this memory generalization. Again, at least this looks like this has supported our hypothesis, right? Like maybe there's a performance difference at least between these two conditions. So we thought, oh, this is good news so far, okay, for our hypotheses. Yeah, I'm foreshadowing there. And so yeah, there's something going on. I will note here, again, I don't make a big deal of it because it's a small effect and I'm still not convinced. There is we found a very slight speeded effect for remote memories in that participants did find things that they had learned the day before, they responded to them quicker. So that was a reaction time difference, but for the recent versus remote conditions. Again, I'm not going to make a big deal of it, but there was a slight speed up for memories that were for discriminations that were learned on the previous day of scanning, the day before scanning. Okay, but yeah, I mentioned over here that kind of progressive learners outperformed their on the inference trials. They actually performed better on the inference trials than the direct trials, and the reason for that is that in a way you can think of inferred trials as being a little bit less ambiguous than directly trained trials, or discriminations, because there's a jump of at least 2. When you make an inference. When you make an inference, you're jumping, you can tell that you might be able to tell that there's a bigger difference between B and D than there is a difference between B and C. The distance between those two stimuli in a space, in this hierarchy is larger. And so if you've encoded a structured representation of the task, it should be more obvious to you that there is that big difference, that B is better than D relative to, say, B is better than C, because they're further apart in the hierarchy. And so one way of looking at that is to see whether performance varies by I call this transitive separation or transitive distance. So you might say that B versus D is a distance of 2, a delta 2. B versus E is a distance of delta 3, and B versus F is a distance of delta 4. So I'll use that kind of notation for these separation between the hierarchies. And indeed, we do see in general, it's not significant in each condition, but overall, you do find that there is performance does increase as the separation between inferred wall textures increases in an inference trial. Sorry, let me be clear about that. As the transitive distance between wall textures increase, inference performance goes up. So you can kind of see the slopes here are positive. They're not significantly positive within each condition, but overall there is a positive trend. I don't want to make a huge deal of that with this data because it's the effects are very weak and pretty much non-significant. But likewise, you do see a similar speeded advantage for larger transitive distances in reaction times and response times. Okay, but really what we were looking at here is what we wanted to look at here was whether these kind of the gap between inferred trials actually told us something about whether participants were using a retrieval-based model of memory generalization, whether they were or an encoding-based model. Let me explain what I mean by that, because these two different classes of models make quite different predictions about how performance should change as the transitive separation increases. In a retrieval-based model of generalization, inference requires you to retrieve all of the directly trained associations along that chain. So if I was making, for instance, the inference C is better than F, stimulus C is better than stimulus F, and I should choose C over F. In order to make that inference on the fly, I need to retrieve 3 separate directly trained associations. C is greater than D is greater than E, and E is greater than F. And I need to retrieve all of them in order to make that inference. And so you might expect that, if there's some error or loss in my ability to retrieve any one of these directly trained associations, then it will make me worse at doing the inference task, or doing this particular inference. And so it's kind of that these models would really expect transitive distance to have a negative effect on performance, that as the distance between inferred wall textures increases, performance should actually go get worse. As I've kind of hinted to you before, encoding-based models make the opposite prediction. Firstly, when you retrieve C versus make this C versus F inference, you're only recalling one structured code to begin with. So you're only recalling one memory representation to begin with. But also the distance between C versus F is much larger than, say, C versus D. And so it should be more obvious to you that C is more preferred than F. So these two broad classes make different predictions based on the effect of this transitive separation between different wall textures. And we very roughly formalized those predictions into 2 models. One model that I'll call the OR model is this kind of encoding-based model of memory generalization that says that performance should increase as the separation between wall textures increases, and the AND model, which says that performance should decrease as the separation increases. Why does it decrease? Because you have to retrieve every single one of the associations that mediate that discrimination. So 2 competing models, and these are behavioral models. I'm not introducing any fMRI data just yet. We tested these models together. They had basically the same number of free parameters. They were very similarly structured based on exactly the same data. And the idea was that you predict a participant's behavioral performance on the inferred trials given their performance on the directly trained trials alone. So that's what we were doing with these 2 models. So remember, the OR model is the encoding-based model of memory generalization. The AND model is the retrieval-based model. And here I'm plotting the error of each model, basically. So lower is better. Lower indicates a better fit to the data. And across the board, really, for in both the progressive and the interleaved learning conditions, and across the recent and remote conditions, we found an overall better fit for the encoding-based OR model, that relative to the AND model. So it really does look that overall, even though we did see this big performance difference between interleaved and progressive learners, all of the performance data alone looks like it favors an encoding-based model of memory generalization in our task. That all of our participants, their behavioral data match the predictions of an encoding-based model of memory generalization before we even looked at the fMRI data. That's what the conclusion that we came to. Okay. To the fMRI data now. So that's our first take home, if you like, that the behavioral data really closely supports an encoding-based model of memory generalization. What did the fMRI data look like? Well, here we were interested in 8 key regions of interest, and we had no reason to suspect that there would be any laterality differences, but we didn't know. A lot of the literature has found effects of transitive inference in the right hemisphere and not the left. So what we did was we said we would have for every region of interest we had in the left hemisphere, we'd have a separate region in the right hemisphere. And this gave us 8 regions of interest. We had the left hippocampus, the right hippocampus, the left entorhinal cortex and the right entorhinal cortex. And then from these were predefined based on previous studies, the medial prefrontal cortex, 2 regions of interest in the medial prefrontal cortex in each hemisphere. So a superior region, medial prefrontal cortex ROI, and an inferior medial prefrontal cortex ROI. So 8 in total. And in these regions, we did expect there to be some, we expected to find, according to the encoding models, that these regions should encode structured task representations that encode the hierarchy that we taught people as a whole. And according to retrieval-based models, the hippocampus should be responsible for doing the on-the-fly inference. So when it comes to doing the inferred trials, we expected to see differences in bold activity in the right hippocampus, in the left, in the hippocampus in general, when people were doing the inference, if they were using a retrieval-based mechanism to do that inference, whereas we might expect to see hierarchies across all of these regions, according to the encoding-based models of memory generalization. So I'll first talk about the univariate bold effects, the effects of just average level of bold activity when doing these directly trained discriminations inside the scanner versus the inferred discriminations inside the scanner. And there's only one region that really showed an effect, the left superior medial prefrontal cortex. So that would be this region highlighted in green in this rightmost panel. So this was really the only area that showed a univariate bold effect in the left hemisphere, again, I say, and it was really it showed an interaction between progressive and interleaved learning versus direct versus inferred. So a two-way interaction between training method and trial type, if you like. So basically, progressive learners deactivate or deactivate relative to the implicit baseline this region just as much for both directly trained and inferred discriminations, where there's less bold activity, or you might say more deactivation in this region on inference trials in interleaved learners. So there's some general difference here that you might associate with the performance difference between conditions. So it may be involved in this task. I'm not going to make a big deal about this just yet. What we were really interested with the fMRI data was whether patterns of multivariate patterns of bold activity in each of these ROIs kind of would allow us to make the inference that they are encoding this a structured task representation, a representation of the hierarchy as a whole. So A being at the top of the hierarchy, B being the next highest, and so on and so forth. And to do that, what we did was we estimated patterns of activity of specific wall textures in a pre-processing step. So the first thing that we did, we found a pattern of bold activity that represented stimulus A, a pattern of bold activity that represented stimulus B, and so on and so forth. And we used all of the data from the scanner that we had in order to estimate those bold patterns. Those are estimated from both directly trained and inferred trials. And then we basically, if we were looking for a representation that encoded the hierarchy as a whole, we would expect the similarity maybe between A and B to be relatively high, and the same as the similarity between B and C, because they're both separated by a distance of 1. But we would expect, say, a jump of 2, say, between A and C, that would have the similarity between those two stimuli would be less. The representational similarity between those two stimuli would be less. So we'd expect representational similarity between these two different types of between these wall textures to drop off linearly. This is the assumption that we're making, linearly in accordance with the separation between wall textures in this hierarchy, if participants were encoding a structured task representation as predicted by encoding models of generalization. And we did We did see that. So we saw that in 3 regions specifically, in the left hippocampus, the left entorhinal cortex, and the left inferior medial prefrontal cortex this time. Those are at least the regions where our effects survived corrections for multiple comparisons using classical inferences. And I'm plotting the effect here. So as the separation between representations increases, the similarity decreases. This is the effect in the left hippocampus, which actually showed the strongest effect, which is why I'm showing it. Bear in mind that is the strongest effect. That's the neatest one. And this is across all conditions. Discriminations learned on the first day of training, so those are the remote conditions versus the remote wall textures versus the ones learned recently, collapsed across all participants. This is what it looks like. You can kind of see a slope downwards, if you like. And using this data, you can then try and reconstruct what the hierarchy looks like based on the brain data alone. And if you do that, what you would hope to see is a straight line where wall texture A is at the top of the hierarchy and wall texture G is at the bottom of the hierarchy. Instead, you kind of get this wiggly line. But what's interesting about this, or what's important, I guess, is that they are linearly separable. So in 2 dimensions, you can draw straight lines between these to separate them. There is some structure in this reconstruction, and we can certainly tell that there is some structure related to the hierarchy in this multidimensional scaling. This is a multidimensional scaling of the similarity data. I'm plotting here again for the left hippocampus. But as I say, we saw this in the left entorhinal cortex and the left inferior medial prefrontal cortex. Now, as I've said, these are the data collapsed across recent and remote conditions, and also the progressive and interleaved learners together. This encompasses all of the participants in one. It was all done in one mixed effects model. So we're plotting it here all together. We've plotted it separately as well elsewhere if you want to see those. But these are the effects collapsed across everything. And we did that because there was no notable interactions with performance, which is odd, right? Because some participants were basically at chance in doing the inference task on either the remote discriminations or the recent discriminations. Some of the participants just were not able to do some of the transitive inferences. Yet we didn't find any interaction that indicated that the structure that we were picking up on in these regions was actually less strong in those participants than in those participants. There was no, there appeared, this slope basically did not change depending on our participants' level of behavioral performance on the inference task. So that's probably nothing, right? We assumed that we would find something like that, and maybe we were just insensitive to it. So what I did was I tested directly in those participants who were performing at chance, whether there was any significant effect of distance, and still there was. So oddly, even though they were unable to do the inference task, they still appeared to have a structured representation of the hierarchy in each of these regions. And again, we use some Bayesian tests to show that at least in the left hippocampus and the left inferior medial prefrontal cortex, there was more evidence to show that these participants did encode a structured representation of the task, even though they were performing at chance level. That's an interesting idea. I can talk a bit more about why that might be. How can someone have a structured representation of the task without performing very well on the inference task itself? I can talk about that later at the end. Just some other things to wrap up. So were there any regions? At the moment, I've just been talking about these distance effects, these very general distance effects that are indicative of encoding-based models of memory generalization. Were there any different effects that any multivariate effects that led us to that allowed us to say, well, here's the difference between progressive versus interleaved learners. Do we think that there's any regions that are involved in doing that, in discriminating between those two types of those two participants who performed very differently on the task? Well, the left superior medial prefrontal cortex, again, which this is the region that showed the univariate bold difference between training methods. This also showed a similarity effect. So overall, the similarity between wall textures as a whole, neural similarity was higher in progressive learners relative to interleaved learners. There was a large effect. There was also evidence that this effect correlated with behavioral performance. So the better performing you were at the inference task, the more similarity you had, the higher the representational similarity between wall textures of the same day. So that there is something in at least the left superior medial prefrontal cortex that discriminates between these two learning conditions. Finally, very, very quickly, I will start by talk about across hierarchy effects. So as I say, this was very exploratory, but exploratory in an interesting way. So I've moved away now from my prior hypotheses. I should mention that. So this was an exploratory analysis, but after we started this project, much after we started this project, and actually very recently, Tim Berens' group in Oxford have come up with a new model of this Tolman-Eichenbaum machine for memory generalizations, and it's an encoding-based model. I flashed it up earlier as an example of the encoding-based or structural models of memory generalizations. And they say that you do learn these from the get-go. You learn these generalized task structures. They make this very strong prediction that the structure that you learn for different stimuli will be the representations that you learn for different stimuli will be unique in the hippocampus, but general and not specific to any particular set of stimuli in the medial prefrontal cortex. So in the hippocampus, the chain that you learn on day one, according to the Tolman-Eichenbaum machine, the TEM, it should be separate. That representation should be separate for stimuli learnt on day one versus day two. They should have nothing to do with each other. Whereas in the medial prefrontal cortex, that should have a higher level of abstraction, the representations there. And so that medial prefrontal region, the medial prefrontal cortex in general, it's not specific, but the medial prefrontal cortex in general should be able to abstract across the wall textures learnt on different days of training in an experiment. So we directly tested this here with these set of analyses. And this involved basically taking the transitive chain, the wall textures learnt on the first day of training, which I've indexed here with subscript ones, and kind of correlating, finding distance effects across days. So this involves taking wall texture A1 and correlating it with wall texture A2, seeing if there is a high level of similarity between there. In fact, that should be the highest level of similarity because they are delta zero. They are the same wall texture on different days of training. Whereas, you've got wall texture A1 to B2, that is a separation of 1. They're across hierarchies, but you're showing a distance effect of 1. A1 to C2, that's a distance of 2. So here there are different transitive distances for these across hierarchy effects. And the prediction is that only the medial prefrontal cortex should make these abstractions across different days, and not the hippocampus or the entorhinal cortex. And indeed, I mean, I'm not going to make any big deal about the absence of effects, but we didn't see any across hierarchy generalization for the chains learnt on day one versus day two in the entorhinal cortex or the hippocampus. But we did indeed see it as predicted in the as they predicted independently of us in the medial prefrontal cortex. And that's plotted here, plot separately for the interleaved versus progressive conditions. Remember that there is no recent versus remote anymore, because we're kind of finding memory representations that generalize across the recent versus remote stimuli. So there is no recent remote, there's just interleaved versus progressive. And again, you see interestingly, this is the only region where we see any notable effects in the right hemisphere. We see right hemisphere effects in both the medial prefrontal, both superior and inferior medial prefrontal cortices as well. And again, as before, the participants who are incapable of doing the inference task above chance still are able to form these generalized memory representations of that generalize across the 2 days of training. Again, we use some Bayesian tests to show that there was not a lot, but what's the term that they use? I can't remember. Notable, not a great deal of evidence, but some evidence in favor of an effect even in these participants who didn't perform above chance. So that's basically it. So to summarize, progressive training does indeed aid inference, as we kind of expected and predicted, but against our predictions, we basically falsified our a priori hypothesis. The difference between progressive and interleaved training is not, in our task at least, is not due to the use of fundamentally different generalization mechanisms. They're not using encoding versus retrieval-based generalization mechanisms as I first thought. The hippocampus and medial prefrontal cortex maintain generalized task representations independent of reward value. So they're not tied to, knowing that wall texture A is always rewarded, because even participants who aren't able to make that judgment of reward can they still have those representations. Only the medial prefrontal cortex generalizes across different stimuli, so across the 2 days of training. And representations in the medial prefrontal cortex are modulated by the training method, because that's the only region where we saw these. I mean, I guess that's a strong statement actually, but perhaps too strong. But yeah, we did see effects of the training method in the medial prefrontal cortex, and some small effects of overnight consolidation. I've not really gone into those, but yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much for listening. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much, Sam. Does anybody have any questions? I can see that Alan has left comments in the chat.
Cool. Shall I scroll? Oh yeah, Alan. In relation to near versus far discriminations in a linear series, see lots of papers by George Potts. Okay, I will certainly look at that. I haven't seen that.
He's also kind of like, yeah.
So this work was used to argue that spatial mental models are structured differently from the sequences that describe them. The explanation was basically an encoding-based integration of information. Okay, yeah. So I didn't talk about this too much. One thing that I will bring up very briefly, I mentioned how you can get these structured representations even in participants who don't perform very well. There is something that we can draw on in that respect. There is a prediction that we can draw on from the reinforcement learning literature, which says that, if you encode during training a very basic representation that just tells you which stimuli were paired together during training. So this is this representation here, and it's telling you that when you see an A, a wall texture A, it will always be presented with wall texture B. When you see wall texture B, it will always be presented with itself, but also 50% of the time with wall texture A, 50% of the time with wall texture B, and so on and so forth down down the hierarchy. It's just literally telling you the co-occurrence statistics of the environment. With those co-occurrence statistics, you can actually run it through a hypothesized a computation that's thought to be underpinned by the hippocampus, and you will get the kind of distance effects that we were looking for in our representational similarity data. So, but the important thing is that this is independent of reward value. So the distance effects here, they don't depend on knowing. You don't, just by looking at this, you don't know whether A is at the top of the hierarchy or at the bottom. Yeah, you just know that it is closest to B, then next is C, then D. You don't have a sense of order, and you can't. It doesn't allow you to use this hierarchy in itself. It just encodes the order. if you like, the structure as a very abstract entity. And if you want to make an inference that A is greater than B, then you have to do one extra computation in order to make a value judgment. And that's also, this is the successor representation. I've not introduced this properly, but this is the idea of the successor representation. And that successor representations do a very good job of separating out the abstract structure of a task from the rewarded value of particular stimuli. And so this is, again, very post hoc, I should say, but this is our thoughts about why you might have a structural task representation that doesn't seem to coincide with participants' ability to make an inference, because there are some models in which these two concepts of reward value and task structure are dissociated. In fact, they are dissociated in the TEM as well. In the Tolman-Eichenbaum machine that I mentioned at the beginning. So I don't know whether that kind of relates to the point very much. I should get back to the talk.
Does anybody else have any questions? So I can ask one question. So I think it relates to all of this. Like, a lot of what you said relies on splitting out. Your stimuli always appear two on the screen at once, right? So your trials and your events in the scanner rely on presenting two stimuli at once, but a lot of your analyses rely on separately modeling, and you've done some kind of fancy thing that I don't quite understand to separate out independent responses to the thing on the screen in the left and the thing on the screen in the right. And I guess, like, the ones that appear close together in the hierarchy may have a different structure in how they appear, in terms of the trials together.
Yes, they do. Yeah, absolutely. So you're 100% right. That we used a simple linear decomposition, least squares decomposition, to highlight, try and estimate, patterns of activity associated with wall texture A and wall texture B, and so on and so forth. So we tried to separate out from the data when we had presented two at a time. And that's true. If we didn't take that into account, it would be problematic, because it's really just the task structure, or the way that the task was structured experimentally, could interfere with our ability, because now the patterns of the multivariate bold patterns to wall texture A are automatically correlated with the wall textures with wall texture B, because they were shown in the same trials and estimated from the same data. So they have an intrinsic correlation that you need to take into account. But the important thing is that we can estimate that intrinsic correlation and from the data, and we can try and, for want of a better term, regress it out. We can see the effect of that and generalize across all of the all of the trials. The other thing is that we checked beforehand and made sure that that was actually counter to what we were predicting with our representational similarity. So if it was the case that the closeness was related to the similarity of wall textures was only dependent on how the task was structured and the co-occurrences of different wall textures in the task, then we should have actually seen a completely different pattern of results to the one we saw. But I do believe that, and this is something that's important to point out, there are still some residual effects of this task structure. And there are things that I can't explain, and it is something that, really does need to be interrogated.
I wonder if you could run that, the analysis that generates the separate independent trials. Is there anything you can do where you plug in the trial images, the pixels from the trial images, and then assess whether or not you get the same structure that you get out from the brain from the images? And as long as you don't, then you can use that to support your argument.
So using the raw trial data alone, you mean?
Well, the pixel information from the raw trial information, and then you attempt to compose out from that some sort of like representation of each individual texture
Yeah.
from the paired images, and then you assess like similarity or something between them.
Well, so there is definitely a because A and B they were always presented in, no, they're not, that's not true, but more often than not, A and B appeared in the same trial inside the scanner than not. That was a very common pairing inside the scanner, if you like. So yeah, the question, if the question is, do we see a similarity effect in line with that? The answer is absolutely yes, we do. And if it's not controlled for, it would be a confound. So yes, we do see that. And the only thing that we've done to try and control for that, other than trying to design the task in a good way, is to incorporate a nuisance term in the models that look for these representational similarity effects, and try and regress them out. But yeah, as I say, if they were, that you would expect completely different effects, not the predicted effects if it's not anti-correlated, it's just orthogonal. These effects our effects of interest are not related to this potential effect in the noise of these that you're estimating, the estimated patterns. But yeah, it sounds like you were suggesting something deeper, and I'm sorry, I can't quite get my head around. Maybe we can talk about it a bit more later.
Sure. I think perhaps Zoltan has a question.
Yeah, just sort of thinking. You're saying that the delta similarity plots that you had don't give enough information to actually solve the task, although they can be part of the solution.
Mm-hmm.
So I was trying to think what would give enough information. Maybe it's perhaps it's implicit in what you've done, but I don't know if there's something further, or you've already done it, which is if presumably A ends up being very similar to some representation of goodness or gold or something like that. And then you'd want the similarity of B to have a certain similarity to A, but not as similar to goodness as A is.
Mm-hmm.
And so on down the line.
Yeah.
And that's a slightly, looking for that pattern is a slightly different thing than the pattern that you looked for.
Yes. Yeah. I've not even thought of that. That's a really good suggestion.
Okay.
Yeah, I've not looked at that. Yeah, the paper is quite large, and certainly I will definitely do it, and it's going to be an exploratory analysis, and it will. This is one of those things. Like, do I commit myself to putting it in the paper? I will certainly put it in the paper as at least as a supplementary analysis. But I completely agree. You're right, and I hadn't actually thought of doing that. That it would be a reasonable thing to test. Yeah, yeah. That there is some sense of goodness, and you can model, or badness if you like as well. Yeah. I agree. Thank you for that. That's a really good suggestion.
Cheers.
I'll definitely do that.
Cool. Okay. Well, I think we'd best wrap up because we're getting to 2:00. So thank you very much, Sam, and thank you everyone for coming. Chris, do you have something to add? So you've just appeared on.
I was wondering if Zoltan could stay on the conversation for 2 seconds, that would be good. But no need to record.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you very much. And next week we have a project proposal from Joel Patchett, who is a new student with Hugo. So. I'll see you all next week.
Bye. Thank you all.
Great talk.
And Sam, do you mind staying on, Zoltan, for a sec?
Not at all.
Yeah, I was